Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Our mission in this deep dive is really just to understand these viewpoints on Crimea, the steps being proposed, sticking only to what's in these sources we have.
Exactly. We'll lay out the different angles, try to get a clearer picture of the concerns and, the potential roadblocks. It's delicate, for sure.
Okay, let's start with Europe's perspective then. The reports suggest there's a strong feeling in Europe that it's difficult to imagine any resolution where Crimea's status actually changes from how it is now.
And that's, obviously a really complicated point for Ukraine.
Yeah.
For them, the 2014 annexation is still a violation of their territory. But this European view, as reported, seems maybe more pragmatic, sort of accepting the current reality as part of a possible way forward.
There's apparently a sense in Europe that the U.S. is pushing pretty hard.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, pushing for a peace deal between Kyiv and Moscow, and fast, like within the first 100 days of President Trump taking office.
That's a deadline. It points to maybe a different sense of urgency, different priorities, perhaps, coming from the U.S. side, according to these reports.
But Europe seems to have drawn some clear red lines. The big one looks like recognizing Crimea as Russian territory.
Right.
Reports say European nations just won't back any U.S. pressure on Ukraine to give that up.
And that really highlights a potential split, doesn't it? Europe seems focused on sovereignty, territorial integrity, at least publicly. They're worried about the precedent it sets.
Yeah, and this difference is causing real worry in Europe, apparently. Fears that these U.S. ideas could, and this is a quote, destroy unity in the EU.
You can see why they'd be concerned, especially thinking back to past disagreements over, say, Russia policy or energy.
It's also reported Europe won't accept anything on Ukraine's sovereignty that President Zelensky himself opposes.
Okay.
So both Crimea and, interestingly, Ukraine's potential NATO membership are seen as red lines for Europe, too.
That fits with their public support for Ukraine's right to choose, positioning themselves as allies, making sure Ukraine has agency in this.
And we're hearing that the big European NATO members are expected to, actively try to talk the U.S. out of any unilateral moves here.
So behind-the-scenes diplomacy, pushing back maybe, suggests some real tension within the alliance if they feel the need to do that.
Yeah, and the potential fallout is a major concern. Strained relations with Washington, undermining security, maybe even, like we said, derailing the NATO summit.
It really makes you wonder about the overall strategy, doesn't it? If chasing a quick deal risks breaking that alliance unity, is that sustainable?
And it's not just NATO. Inside the EU, there are worries too, specifically about disagreements over sanctions on Russia. If the U.S. decides to lift them as part of a deal, that could cause splits, because EU members already have different views on sanctions.
That's a key tool, isn't it? A unilateral U.S. move there would definitely stir things up within the EU.
And there's another layer. Apparently, Europe's worried the U.S. might pressure them on Ukraine to avoid a tariff war.
So linking trade and security, using economic leverage perhaps, shows how tangled all these issues are.
There was also that meeting in London. Quite telling, it seems.
What happened there?
Well, reports say both the U.S. and European participants lowered their level of representation. Kind of last minute.
Why?
Reportedly, because of disagreements over Ukraine being firm about not discussing territory before a ceasefire.
Interesting. That could be signaling, couldn't it? Showing frustration with Ukraine's preconditions, maybe.
Maybe. But the European view, according to these reports, is still that these U.S. proposals are just, ideas for now.
Right.
They're emphasizing that any lasting peace needs conditions both Russia and Ukraine can accept. Which sounds obvious, but it's crucial.
It does sound more cautious, maybe more realistic, acknowledging you can't just impose peace, you need buy-in.
And while European countries apparently support U.S. peace efforts generally, they think a lot still needs discussion. Security for Ukraine, legal stuff, sanctions, all of it.
So a ceasefire is just one step, a big step, obviously, but only one piece of a much bigger puzzle.
Europe's also talking about a peacekeeping mission. But their view is important. It's about monitoring and ensuring Ukraine's future security.
Which contrasts with Russia's idea of demilitarization, right?
Exactly. Very different aims. Europe sees it as protection. Russia wants Ukraine weakened.
Got it.
And for Europe, Ukraine must keep the ability to ask other countries for help with its security. No limits on sovereignty there.
That principle, the right to seek help, seems core to their support for Ukraine's independence.
We also have some direct quotes. Kaja Kallas, an EU diplomat,
Okay.
stated very clearly the EU will never recognize Crimea as Russian. She also apparently suspects Trump will pursue economic ties with Russia anyway, even without mediating, and questioned why the U.S. hasn't used all its leverage on Moscow.
That shows deep skepticism about Russia, and maybe worries that U.S. economic interests might override commitments to Ukraine.
And then Jean-Noël Barrot, a French diplomat, said Europeans have told the U.S. clearly what's non-negotiable in any deal. He stressed protecting French interests, European security, and called Ukraine's territorial integrity a very firm demand.
So reinforcing those red lines again, and highlighting potential friction if U.S. plans are seen as undermining European security or principles.
Okay, let's switch gears now. Let's look at the U.S. position and what they've reportedly been doing.
Right.
We mentioned the timeline, aiming for a peace deal within 100 days of President Trump's inauguration.
Which is, as I said, ambitious, suggests a real push for a quick win, maybe for domestic reasons, or maybe they see a narrow window.
And then there are these reports suggesting the U.S. plan involves recognizing Crimea as Russian territory.
That's the big one.
Yeah, a major point of conflict, not just with Europe, but crucially with Ukraine itself. Just to clarify, annexation in international law means taking territory by force, which is generally seen as illegal.
And U.S. recognition would be a huge shift in policy. It would look like legitimizing Russia's 2014 move, which got widespread condemnation.
Absolutely. And President Zelensky has been very public, very clear. Ukraine will never renounce its claim to Crimea. He called it outside our constitution.
So a direct clash with what the U.S. is reportedly considering. And it shows how sensitive Crimea is inside Ukraine. Any concession would be incredibly unpopular there.
And it seems Zelensky's public statements on this haven't gone down well with U.S. authorities.
Oh.
One report mentioned a White House representative calling his discussion with reporters unacceptable. Pretty strong words.
Suggests the U.S. wants to control the message around these talks. Maybe frustration that Ukraine is drawing its own lines publicly.
President Trump himself weighed in. Said Ukraine isn't expected to legally renounce Crimea, but still called Zelensky's statements inflammatory.
Okay.
And then he gave Zelensky a choice, basically. Peace now, or, his words, 3 more years of war before losing the whole country.
Wow. That's blunt. A very hardline ultimatum, framing it as zero-sum for Ukraine.
Not surprising, then, that there's worry in Kyiv that Trump might blame them if talks fail.
And cut off military aid.
Potentially, yeah. That's the fear, which shows how much Ukraine depends on that Western aid and how vulnerable that makes their position.
Right.
We also saw the U.S. lower its participation in those London talks. Secretary of State Rubio didn't attend.
And the reason given.
Reports say it was concerned that Kyiv might get rigid, hinder progress.
Which could be read as pressure, right? Signaling displeasure with Ukraine, maybe not being ready to discuss territory yet.
Could be. After London, Trump reportedly doubled down, saying Zelensky's statements make a deal harder, and repeated that choice. Peace now, or risk losing everything later.
Just constant pressure, it sounds like. Really pushing for a resolution on their terms, even if it means tough compromises for Ukraine.
And Rubio had said earlier they needed to figure out quickly, like within weeks, if a deal was even possible.
Or else
the U.S. has other priorities to focus on. Suggests a limited window for U.S. mediation here.
They're not going to stick around forever if things stall.
And Trump threatened to pull out of mediation entirely if either side keeps stalling. Said he'd call them fools and terrible people.
That's direct. Shows his impatience, his transactional style. No time for delays, it seems.
Vice President Vance also reportedly said the U.S. made a very fair offer, and it's time for a yes, or the U.S. walks.
So reinforcing that take it or leave it feeling, presenting it as a final offer, not much room to negotiate.
Okay, so let's get into the details of these reported U.S. framework proposals, what's actually on the table, according to the sources.
Right.
First, freezing combat along the current front line.
Standard first step, usually.
Yep.
Stop the shooting, create space for talks. Makes sense.
Second, U.S. recognition of Crimea's 2014 annexation by Russia. We keep coming back to this one.
Yeah, the big concession, hugely controversial for Ukraine and Europe, as we've said.
Third, U.S. recognition of Russia's de facto control, but not sovereignty over some eastern and southern regions.
That's a nuanced one. Acknowledging reality on the ground, maybe, but not giving it full legal blessing. Could be an attempt at a middle path, leaves the final status open, perhaps?
Interesting. The proposals also reportedly include transferring part of the Kharkiv region, currently Russian-controlled, back to Ukraine.
Okay, so maybe a bit of give and take. A territorial gain for Ukraine, potentially balancing out other concessions.
On security. guarantees Ukraine won't join NATO,
Addresses a key Russian concern.
but allows for potential EU membership down the line.
So still offering Ukraine a path towards Europe, just not military alliance with NATO. Tries to square that circle.
The framework also reportedly includes security guarantees for Ukraine, a European peacekeeping mission, possibly forces from other nations.
But not NATO forces.
Right, specifically notes the Kremlin opposes NATO forces. So, guarantees, but within certain limits acceptable to Russia.
Matches what we heard from the European side about peacekeeping aims stability, but mindful of Russia's red lines.
And despite the no NATO guarantee, the proposals apparently place no restrictions on the size of Ukraine's military or the amount of military aid it can get.
That's significant for Ukraine's long-term defense. Means they could still build up their own forces even outside NATO.
Economically, lifting post-2014 sanctions on Russia.
A major carrot for Moscow. Sanctions relief would be a big economic boost.
And increased U.S. Russia economic cooperation is mentioned too.
Right.
Also, ensuring Ukraine has unimpeded shipping on the Dnieper River.
Crucial for their economy, especially agricultural exports. Vital trade route.
And finally, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. This one's complicated.
How so?
Proposal is recognize Ukrainian sovereignty over the area, but the U.S. operates the plant, supplying electricity to both Ukraine and Russia.
Given Russia previously rejected handing over control, U.S. operation is a novel idea. Trying to ensure safety, maybe provide neutral management.
Could be. But it's a tricky point given Russia's stance, and reports say U.S. officials considered these proposals final in a previous meeting.
Really pushing that take-it-or-leave-it narrative again. Limited flexibility.
And it's noted the U.S. is maintaining contact with Moscow about Ukraine, unlike the dialogue with Kyiv in Europe, which seems strained.
Suggests maybe a strategy of dealing directly with Russia, possibly bypassing objections from others.
And a U.S.-Russian meeting is expected soon. Steve Witkoff is reportedly going to Moscow again, fourth time in 3 months.
That's a lot of high-level contact. Indicates very active, serious discussions happening between the U.S. and Russia, likely hammering out details.
Okay, so now let's look at Ukraine's position in all this.
Right. What are they saying?
Well, as we've said, President Zelensky is adamant. Ukraine will never officially give up its claim to Crimea. It's outside our constitution.
That's their cornerstone, not just political, but legal, constitutional. A huge hurdle for any concession there.
And they keep insisting. A full and unconditional ceasefire has to be step one.
Before anything else.
Before anything else. That's their main precondition for more talks. Understandable, really, given the ongoing fighting. Stop the violence first, then talk politics.
Makes sense from their perspective.
And despite the lower representation at the London talks from the U.S. and others, Ukraine kept its full delegation there. Which seems to show they're still committed to trying to find a peaceful way forward, even if it's tough.
Signals they want to stay engaged, even if the dynamics are difficult.
Ukraine has also apparently expressed hope that their focus on an immediate ceasefire actually fits with President Trump's vision for ending the conflict quickly.
Trying to find common ground there. Frame their key demand in a way that might appeal to the U.S. administration.
Seems like a possible diplomatic move, yeah. Find some alignment. And remember that document cited as a reason for the lower-level London meeting.
The one where Kyiv wouldn't discuss territory before a ceasefire.
Exactly. Reports say Kyiv explicitly stated its refusal to discuss territory before a ceasefire is agreed. Highlights that fundamental disagreement on sequencing. Ceasefire first, or talk territory now.
And Ukraine likely feels discussing territory while fighting is still happening puts them at a huge disadvantage. They lose leverage.
That makes sense. Finally, there was that comment from President Trump.
The one about Crimea 11 years ago.
Yeah. Questioning why Ukraine didn't fight harder back then when Russia took it without a shot.
Yeah.
Seems to be part of his thinking.
Right. Reflects a U.S. view, perhaps, that things could have gone differently then. Raises questions about the administration's reading of that history.
So wrapping this up, you really see this complex mix of views.
Definitely.
Europe seems reluctant to concede Crimea, wary of the U.S. push for a quick deal that might recognize the current situation.
While the U.S., based on these reports, is pushing hard for that deal, maybe using deadlines and ultimatums.
And Ukraine is standing firm on its territory, especially Crimea, and demanding that ceasefire first.
Yeah, this deep dive into the sources really paints a picture of competing priorities, very clear red lines, different strategies, all focused on Crimea and how to end this conflict.
And we've really focused today on just presenting those different viewpoints, those proposed steps, as outlined in the sources we looked at. We haven't added our own analysis or conclusion.
Exactly. The goal was just to give you a clear understanding of the different positions based on the information available to us right now.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.